The evening was quiet, the kind that felt soft around the edges. The small community theater was already buzzing with chatter, filled with people from nearby neighborhoods. There were families, couples, and friends who had all come together to enjoy the local charity music night. The place wasn't fancy, but it carried warmth, strings of fairy lights along the walls, the faint scent of coffee and freshly baked cookies coming from the snack corner, and the sound of people greeting one another with laughter. Near the back sat a woman who seemed almost invisible in the crowd. She wore a simple blue sweater and a long skirt, her hair tied back neatly. She wasn't one to draw attention. Most people knew her from the town's small school, where she worked quietly as a piano teacher. She never boasted about her skills or spoke much about her past. To many, she was just a kind, polite woman who always smiled when spoken to, and spent her free time helping children learn music. That night, she had come only to listen. She had no plans to perform, no desire to stand on stage. She simply wanted to enjoy the show, to sit among others, to feel the music lift the air, and maybe for a few hours to forget her own quiet loneliness. The event began with cheerful energy. One by one, the local performers came forward. A group of teenagers played guitars and sang pop songs. An elderly man recited poetry while his granddaughter played the flute. Each act received gentle applause, a few whistles, and warm smiles. The night was meant to celebrate community spirit, not competition, and that made it special. As the show went on, the host, a lively man with a friendly voice, kept the mood light. He cracked small jokes, spoke kindly about each performer, and made sure everyone felt welcome. But halfway through the evening, a small problem arose. The performer scheduled for the next slot hadn't arrived. The host checked his list again and sighed. The next act was supposed to be a piano duet, one that people had been looking forward to. He tried calling the performers' names, but there was no answer. The audience began to murmur. The piano on stage sat quietly, waiting under the warm lights, its black surface shining softly. After a moment, the host smiled in an attempt to cover the awkwardness. "Well, it seems our next performers might be stuck in traffic," he said with a chuckle. "Does anyone here play the piano? Maybe we have a hidden star among us tonight." The crowd laughed politely. Someone in the front joked, "Let's get a volunteer," and people began looking around playfully, nudging each other. That was when a small voice from one corner whispered, "She plays." The woman in the blue sweater looked up, surprised. A few people who knew her turned their heads, too. "Go on," someone said softly. "You teach piano, don't you? You should play something." Her cheeks flushed. She waved her hand quickly, smiling shyly. "Oh, no, I couldn't. I didn't come to perform." But the teasing continued in good fun. The host noticed the commotion and leaned forward with a grin. We might have a pianist among us. Would you care to give us a little tune?" The spotlight turned slightly toward where she sat. A few people clapped encouragingly. Others watched with curiosity, not in a mean way, but with that familiar mix of excitement and expectation that audiences often have. The woman hesitated. Her heart began to race. It had been years since she had played in front of a crowd. Once, long ago, she had dreamed of performing, but life had gone in another direction. She had chosen teaching, family, and simple joys over the stage. But in that moment, with everyone's eyes on her, she felt both fear and a strange pull deep inside. She smiled nervously and shook her head again, hoping the moment would pass. But then the host said kindly, "Just one tune. No pressure at all. We'd love to hear you." The audience began to clap lightly, a rhythm of encouragement. She could feel her pulse matching their rhythm. Something within her stirred, not pride, not the wish to prove anything, but a small whisper that said, "Why not?" Taking a slow breath, she stood up. The applause grew a little louder, though still warm and kind. She felt her hands trembling as she walked toward the stage. The wooden floor creaked softly under her shoes. Every step felt heavier than the last. When she reached the piano, she paused. Under the lights, everything seemed brighter, sharper. The faces in the front row, the smooth black surface of the piano, even the slight hum of the air conditioner above. She brushed her hands over the piano's edge and looked down at the keys. Her reflection glimmered faintly on the polished lid. For a moment, she didn't move. The audience waited, whispering softly. The host gave her a gentle nod from the side. She sat down on the bench, adjusted her skirt, and took another deep breath. Her fingers rested lightly on the keys, testing their coolness. She could almost hear her father's voice in her memory, a calm, patient man who had once taught her to play when she was just a child. He used to tell her, "Don't just play the notes, listen to them. Let them speak for you." It had been so long since she'd heard his words, but now they came back like an old song. The hall felt different suddenly. The playful mood had softened into curiosity and silence. People leaned forward slightly. Even the host had stopped smiling and was watching quietly. Her heart pounded. She thought about leaving, just standing up, apologizing, and walking back to her seat. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the memory of her father. Maybe it was the quiet ache of years spent behind others, never in the light. She let out one long, trembling breath, then pressed a single key. A soft, clear note filled the air. It echoed gently through the hall, fragile and beautiful. Then another note followed, then another. The sound was small at first, hesitant, like a bird testing its wings. But even in those first few seconds, something about it felt real, unpolished but full of feeling. The crowd fell completely silent. The noise, the whispers, the shifting of seats, all disappeared. The woman didn't look up. Her eyes stayed on the keys, her fingers moving slowly, uncertainly. She wasn't playing for applause or attention. She was simply remembering the warmth of her childhood home, the night she spent practicing beside her father, the joy of making music that spoke when words failed. When she finished the first few bars, she paused. Her hands hovered in the air, trembling. The piano sat quietly again, waiting for her next touch. The audience held its breath. In that stillness, she realized something. This wasn't about showing off or being brave. It was about connection. It was about bringing to life a part of herself that had been silent for too long. She took another deep breath. Her fingers touched the keys again, more sure this time. The melody began to take shape, soft but full of heart, and though no one knew it yet, this was only the beginning of a moment that would stay with them forever. A moment when one woman, with nothing but her hands and a piano, would turn a quiet evening into something unforgettable. For a few seconds, the hall stayed completely still. The woman's fingers hovered above the keys as if she was afraid to move. The light from the stage lamp touched her hands gently, and the crowd waited, breath held, wondering what she would do next. Then, slowly, she began to play again. The sound was soft at first, a delicate melody that flowed like water down a quiet stream. Each note carried something, not just music, but emotion, memories, small pieces of her life. The audience could feel it, though they didn't know why. There was something honest about the way she played, something that reached beyond the notes. Her shoulders relaxed slightly as her hands began to move more freely. She stopped thinking about the people watching her. She wasn't performing anymore. She was remembering. Every note she played seemed to bring her closer to a part of herself she had forgotten. The part that used to dream, that used to feel alive when she touched the piano. People in the audience leaned forward, drawn in without realizing it. The chatter that had filled the hall earlier was gone. Even the children, who had been restless just minutes ago, sat quietly with wide eyes. The host stood off to the side, arms folded, completely still. He had seen many performers in his time, professionals, amateurs, and nervous beginners. But there was something different about this woman. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wasn't showing off. She was simply playing from her heart, and that somehow was far more powerful than any perfect performance. Her fingers began to move faster, not in a showy way, but with growing emotion. It was as though every hidden feeling she had kept inside for years was being poured out through her hands. All the love, the loss, the dreams, and the quiet strength. At one point, she closed her eyes completely. The world around her faded, the faces, the lights, even the stage itself. All she could hear was the sound of her own music, and in that moment it felt like her father was there again, sitting beside her, smiling the way he used to when she got a difficult piece right. One of the older women in the audience wiped a tear from her cheek. She didn't even know why she was crying. Something in that melody reminded her of her own life, the way music can reach a place inside that words never could. A young man in the back, who had been scrolling on his phone earlier, slowly put it away. He found himself staring at the pianist, unable to look away. There was no flashiness, no dramatic gestures, just pure feeling, honest and simple. The woman didn't notice any of it. Her world had shrunk down to the keys beneath her hands and the music flowing out of them. Each sound echoed softly around the room, filling every corner with warmth. It wasn't the kind of song people heard on the radio. It didn't follow any popular tune, but it had something far more important. It was real. After a few minutes, she reached a part of the piece that changed in tone. The soft melody deepened, becoming more emotional, almost sad. Her hands slowed, her body leaning into the keys as if she was trying to hold on to something slipping away. The sound grew richer, fuller, like a story unfolding, one that told of love, loss, and quiet strength. Her eyes were wet now, but she didn't stop. The memories behind her music were both painful and beautiful. The tune she was playing had once been her father's favorite. She remembered sitting beside him as a child, watching his hands move gracefully across the piano, wondering if she'd ever play like that one day. And now here she was, and playing his tune alone, but with him still somehow in every note. The people in the audience could feel it. They didn't know her story, but they felt the weight of it. They could sense that this was more than a performance. It was a conversation between the past and the present, between a daughter and the memory of her father. The host took a deep breath, glancing toward the crowd. He saw faces filled with emotion. People who had come expecting light entertainment now sat motionless, touched by something deeper. The room, once filled with laughter and chatter, now felt sacred in a way that words couldn't describe. The woman's hands began to tremble slightly as she reached the most emotional part of the piece. Her fingers pressed harder against the keys, and the piano responded with a sound that felt like both sorrow and strength. It was the kind of music that seemed to speak directly to the soul, a cry, a whisper, and a promise all at once. When the melody softened again, the tension in the air slowly began to melt. The woman's movements became gentler, her breathing steadier. She was no longer afraid. She had faced the fear of being seen, and instead of judgment, she found silence. The good kind, the kind that comes when people are truly listening. For a moment, she allowed herself to look up. The faces in front of her weren't mocking or impatient. They were kind, still, and moved. That sight filled her with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. She smiled softly, just a small fleeting smile, and then looked back down at the piano. Her fingers glided through the final lines of the tune, letting each note linger before fading away. She didn't rush. She let the song breathe, as if giving it permission to live a little longer before it ended. The melody began to settle into its final rhythm, a peaceful, tender close that felt like the end of a story. Her touch was gentle, almost like a whisper. The sound of the last few notes stretched through the hall, each one softer than the last, until finally there was nothing left but silence. The woman sat still, her hands resting on the keys. She didn't move for several seconds, almost afraid to break the moment. She could feel her heart beating fast, her breath shallow. The music had left her trembling, not from fear but from release. It was as though she had let go of something heavy that she'd been carrying for far too long. Then she heard it. A single clap, quiet but steady. Someone in the audience had started applauding softly. Then another joined in, and then another. Within seconds, the entire hall filled with the sound of hands coming together. The woman looked up, startled. People were standing, not out of politeness, but from genuine emotion. Some were smiling through tears. Others simply stared, speechless. The applause grew louder, echoing through the small hall like thunder, but warm, full of gratitude. The woman rose slowly from the bench. She didn't know what to say or how to react. She simply bowed her head slightly, her eyes still glistening, and smiled. A shy, honest smile. The host stepped forward, clapping harder than anyone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice filled with admiration, "I think we just witnessed something truly special tonight." The woman shook her head softly, almost embarrassed, and whispered, "It was just one tune." But everyone in that room knew it wasn't just one tune. It was something far greater, something real, raw, and unforgettable. And though the night would continue, nothing that followed would come close to the quiet magic of that single moment, when a simple woman sat at a piano and made the whole room feel again. As she left the stage, her heart felt lighter than it had in years. She didn't need to win anything or prove herself. That one song, that one chance moment had been enough, and though she didn't know it yet, it would be a night no one would ever forget. The applause echoed in her ears long after she had stepped away from the stage. She could still feel the vibration of the piano under her fingers, the sound of those last fading notes playing over and over in her mind. As she walked back to her seat, people she barely knew smiled at her, nodding with respect and admiration. Some even reached out to pat her shoulder gently as she passed. Her face felt warm and her hands were still trembling slightly. It wasn't from fear anymore, it was something else, something deeper. She couldn't quite explain it, but inside her chest there was a strange feeling of peace and relief. For so many years she had played quietly at home, never in front of a crowd, never letting her music touch anyone beyond the walls of her small room. But tonight everything felt different. She sat down again and looked around the hall. The lights on the stage had dimmed for the next performer, and the host had returned to his cheerful tone. Yet even as he spoke, people were still whispering about her performance. She could hear bits and pieces. That was beautiful. Did you see her play? I didn't know she could do that. She smiled faintly to herself and looked down at her hands resting in her lap. Those same hands that had washed dishes, carried groceries, written notes for her students. Tonight they had spoken in a language that didn't need words. The rest of the show passed in a blur. A singer came on stage and sang softly, but even she seemed moved by what had just happened. The audience clapped politely for everyone, but the energy in the room had changed. It felt calmer, quieter, as if something inside everyone had shifted a little. When the event finally ended, the lights came up fully. People began to gather their things, talking to one another as they prepared to leave. The woman stood slowly, ready to slip out quietly, but she didn't get far before someone stopped her. It was the host. He walked up to her with a wide smile and said, "That was something special. You have a gift." You could feel it in the room, and everyone did. She shook her head modestly. "It was just one song," she said softly. He laughed kindly. "Maybe to you, but sometimes one song is enough to touch 100 hearts." You reminded people tonight what real music feels like. She didn't know how to respond. Compliments always made her shy. She simply smiled and thanked him before heading toward the door. But before she could leave, a few others stopped her too. A young couple who said her music made them cry. An older man who said it reminded him of his wife. And even a teenager who asked what song it was because he wanted to learn it on the piano himself. Their words touched her more than she expected. She had never thought her playing could move anyone so deeply. For years she had believed that her time had passed, that she was just a small-town teacher with an old love for music that didn't matter anymore. But tonight she saw something different, that maybe even in small moments she still had something to give. When she finally stepped outside, the night air was cool and fresh. The sky was clear, with stars scattered above like tiny lights. She took a deep breath, letting it fill her lungs. It felt like the first full breath she had taken in a long time. She began walking home slowly. The streets were quiet now, only the soft sound of her footsteps echoing on the pavement. Her thoughts drifted back to her father, to the sound of his laughter, to the way he used to hum while he played. She remembered how proud he had been when she first learned that same tune, how he'd told her she played with heart, not just skill. As she reached her small home, she unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house was silent, just as she'd left it. She turned on a small lamp and sat down at her own piano, the one she had owned for years but hadn't truly played in a long time. Her fingers traced the keys gently, the same way they had earlier that night. She smiled softly. It was strange. After playing in front of so many people, she didn't feel nervous anymore. She felt alive. She pressed a single key and listened to the note ring out in the quiet room. Then another. Soon the melody from earlier began to flow again, the same one that had filled the hall, but softer now, more personal. It wasn't for an audience this time. It was just for her. As she played, she felt tears slide down her cheeks. But they weren't sad tears. They were warm, freeing. She wasn't mourning her past anymore. She was reconnecting with it. The next morning, the small town was buzzing with talk about the event. People shared videos on their phones, short clips someone had recorded of her playing. The sound wasn't perfect. There was background noise and the occasional cough, but even through the tiny speakers, the feeling in her music came through. By afternoon, she received a call from the community center. The director asked if she would be willing to play again for their next event, maybe even teach a short session for adults who wanted to learn. She hesitated at first. The thought of performing again made her heart race. But then she remembered how it felt, that quiet moment when the music had silenced the room, when people had truly listened. "I'll think about it," she said, smiling into the phone. Later that week, she went back to the theater, not for a show but to return a borrowed book. The stage was empty, the piano still sitting there in the same spot. She walked up to it, running her fingers along the smooth wood. It almost felt alive, like it remembered her too. The custodian nearby looked up and smiled. "You're the lady who played last week, right?" "I was working backstage." "That was something else. You should have seen everyone's faces. I've been working here for years and I've never seen a reaction like that." She laughed softly, a bit embarrassed. "Thank you," she said. As she left the building, she realized that maybe her life didn't have to be as small as she'd made it. Maybe music wasn't something that belonged only to her past. Maybe it was still her way to connect. To others, to herself, to memories that would never fade. That night, she sat by the window with a cup of tea, the faint sound of her piano still in her ears. She thought about how one unexpected moment could change everything, how a simple act, done with honesty, could touch so many hearts. She smiled to herself and whispered, almost as if her father could still hear her, "I played again." The room felt warm even in the quiet. The world outside seemed softer somehow, more peaceful. And deep down she knew this wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of something new, something beautiful that she hadn't expected but was ready to welcome. She had played just one tune, but that tune had awakened something inside her, something she thought was gone forever. And from that night on, she promised herself she would never let that silence return. The days after that night felt strange and wonderful all at once. Everywhere she went, people would stop her to mention the performance. Sometimes it was a simple nod or a smile. Sometimes someone would come forward and tell her how much the music had meant to them. Even strangers seemed to recognize her now, and she found herself smiling shyly, unsure how to respond. She hadn't expected any of this. For years, she had moved through life quietly, teaching her students, visiting the market, walking through the park, almost invisible in the world. And now, with just one tune, she had touched so many hearts. She felt a strange mix of pride and embarrassment. Pride because the music was hers and it had been heard and felt. Embarrassment because she wasn't used to being the center of attention. That evening, she returned home and sat at her piano again. The soft lamplight fell across the keys and she ran her fingers lightly over them. The memory of the theater, the warmth of the applause, and the faces of the people still lingered. She could almost hear the echoes of their hearts listening to her, and it made her chest tighten in a way that was both thrilling and scary. She pressed a key softly and let the sound float in the quiet room. One note, then another. Slowly, the melody began to form again. The same one she had played before, but this time she allowed herself to explore it, to linger on certain parts, to stretch the pauses where the emotion was strongest. She closed her eyes and let the music take over, as if she were speaking without words. For the first time in years, she felt completely free. The world outside didn't exist for those moments. There were no expectations, no rules, no judgments. Just her, the piano, and the music. It was a feeling she hadn't realized she had missed so much. The next day, she walked through town, thinking about how one song could make such a difference. She saw the bakery where she often bought bread, and the shopkeeper waved at her warmly. "We all watched the video online," he said. "You played beautifully. The whole town is talking about it." She smiled softly, a little embarrassed. "It was nothing," she said, though she knew it was more than nothing. She could feel the truth of it, that her music had moved people in ways she hadn't expected. She spent the morning teaching her students, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the piano. She found herself imagining new tunes, new melodies, small fragments of songs she had never played out loud. There was a spark inside her now, a quiet excitement that had been dormant for years. She realized she didn't want to keep her music locked away anymore. Later that afternoon, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from the community center. They wanted her to perform again at their next event. She stared at the paper for a long time, unsure how to respond. The thought of playing in front of people again made her heart beat faster. But she remembered the feeling she had had on stage, the moment when her music had filled the room and everyone had been silent. Listening, she smiled to herself and wrote back a simple note. "I would be happy to play." The days leading up to the event were filled with quiet anticipation. She practiced each day, Not because she wanted to impress anyone, but because she wanted to feel ready. She explored the piano more deeply, allowing her fingers to wander over keys she hadn't touched in years. She tried new melodies and old favorites, finding joy in each note. On the day of the event, she arrived early. The hall was different from the small theater she had played in before. This place was larger, with a higher ceiling and more seats. A gentle hum of excitement filled the air as people arrived. She could see families, children, older couples, and even some faces from the theater performance. She felt a flutter of nerves, but also a deep sense of calm. She was ready. As she approached the stage, the piano sat there quietly, waiting. She ran her hands along the keys, feeling their coolness and smoothness, and then sat down. The crowd was attentive, but unlike before, there was no pressure. They were there to listen, not to judge. She began with the same tune she had played the night of the theater. The first note rang out softly, and the audience leaned forward. She allowed the melody to unfold naturally, adding little pauses and gentle swells in the music. The sound was familiar, yet alive with something new. A maturity, a depth she hadn't realized she possessed. As she played, she noticed the faces in the audience. Some had tears in their eyes, others smiled softly, and a few simply stared, completely absorbed. The energy in the room was palpable. She could feel it feeding her, giving her strength to let the music flow even more freely. The melody grew, not in volume but in feeling. She allowed herself to add subtle variations, small changes that brought new emotion to the song. Each note was deliberate, each pause meaningful. She wasn't just playing. She was telling a story, one of hope, remembrance, and the beauty of small moments. Time seemed to pass differently that night. She played longer than she had expected, but she didn't notice. She was lost in the music, her fingers moving almost instinctively across the keys. The audience didn't interrupt. They simply listened, captivated by the honesty of her playing. At one point, she glanced up just briefly and caught the gaze of a young boy in the front row. He looked at her with wide eyes, as if trying to memorize every movement, every subtle expression. She smiled softly at him and then returned to the keys. That tiny connection reminded her why she played, not for fame or recognition, but for moments like this, when music could reach someone's heart directly. The piece gradually shifted into a softer, more reflective section. She allowed her emotions to guide her fingers, letting memories of her childhood, her father, and the quiet nights spent practicing alone weave into the music. The notes carried a gentle melancholy, but also warmth and light. By the time she reached the final notes, the audience was completely still. Every person was listening intently, almost afraid to break the magic of the moment. She pressed the last key softly, letting it ring out and fade naturally into silence. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then slowly applause began, at first soft, then louder and louder. People stood, some wiping tears from their eyes. Others clapped with an energy that shook the hall. She felt a warmth spread through her chest. Not pride, not triumph, but a deep, satisfying joy. The host returned to the stage, smiling broadly. "What you just experienced," he said, voice trembling slightly with emotion, "is a gift. Music that speaks to the heart, that connects us to something bigger than ourselves. We are truly honored to witness this." She lowered her head and nodded, feeling both shy and grateful. She didn't need to say anything. The music had already spoken for her. After the performance, people approached her to thank her, to share how much the music had moved them. Some were students inspired to learn piano. Others were adults reminded of memories they had almost forgotten. Every word made her smile, sometimes tear up quietly. She realized something powerful. Her music didn't just belong to her. It belonged to anyone willing to listen, anyone willing to feel. That night, walking home under the stars, she felt lighter than she had in years. Her footsteps were soft but confident. She knew the music inside her had found its way back into the world, and she had a feeling it would never leave again. She sat by her window later, looking out at the quiet town. The piano waited for her in the corner of the room, its presence comforting. She thought about the journey she had begun, starting with a single tune that had opened so many hearts. She realized her life had changed, not because she had sought attention, but because she had allowed herself to be vulnerable and share something real. For the first time in a long while, she felt ready for whatever came next. The music had given her courage, and with courage came possibilities she had never imagined. She whispered softly to herself, "This is just the beginning," and smiled. The quiet night seemed alive, full of promise. And she knew deep in her heart that she would never stop playing, never stop sharing the music that lived inside her. The next performance event arrived quietly, but it felt different this time. She walked into the hall with a calm, steady heart, yet inside her a small flutter of nerves remained. She had performed twice now in front of people, yet each time felt new and alive, as though no amount of practice could prepare her for the magic of those first notes filling the room. The hall was bigger than the theater where she had first played, filled with rows of chairs and the soft hum of anticipation. People whispered to one another, excited to see her again. Word had spread through the town and beyond. She was the woman who had played that single unforgettable tune and moved everyone. But she tried not to think about the attention. She focused instead on the piano, the familiar black keys that waited for her touch. The host welcomed everyone and introduced her to the audience, speaking softly about her first performance and the way it had touched so many hearts. She listened to his words, smiling politely, but her mind remained on the music. She didn't play to prove herself. She played to share a part of her soul with anyone willing to feel it. As she sat at the piano, she ran her fingers lightly across the keys. They felt familiar, comforting, like old friends greeting her after years apart. She closed her eyes for a moment and let her memory drift back to the first night, to the faces in the theater, to the sound of silence that had followed her opening note. It had been terrifying and exhilarating all at once. And now, here she was again, ready to create that magic a second time. The first note rang out softly. She let it linger, allowing it to fill the air and reach every corner of the room. The audience immediately became still, drawn into the sound without realizing it. She began to play the same melody she had started with the first night, but this time she let it grow naturally. She explored its depths, stretching some notes, letting others fall gently into silence. Each movement of her hands, each rise and fall of the tune, was deliberate yet effortless. She could feel the energy in the room, the way people leaned forward in their chairs, how their eyes followed her fingers on the keys. They weren't just listening, they were experiencing the music, letting it touch their hearts in ways words could never achieve. Her fingers moved faster now, carrying more emotion with every note. She let the melody tell a story of its own, a story of hope, of love that had been lost and found, of quiet courage, and of simple joy. She thought about all the moments she had hidden herself away, all the times she had let fear or doubt stop her, and now playing in front of so many people, she felt a deep sense of freedom. As she reached the middle of the piece, the music shifted. It became more passionate, more intense. Her hands danced over the keys with confidence and grace. Each chord resonated through the hall like a heartbeat, steady and strong. She could feel tears gathering in her eyes, but she didn't stop. She let them fall quietly, letting the emotion flow through her fingers into the piano. The audience was silent, mesmerized. Some had tears streaming down their cheeks. Others were holding their breath, afraid to blink and miss a single moment. Even the host, standing off to the side, looked as though he had forgotten to breathe, completely captivated by the depth and beauty of the music. A young girl in the front row clutched her mother's hand tightly, her eyes wide and shining. She had never heard music like this before, music that seemed to reach inside her and make her feel understood without words. The woman at the piano didn't notice the girl, didn't notice anyone. She was lost in the music, letting it guide her. The piece continued to grow, each note building upon the last. It was no longer just a song. It was a journey. The highs were bright and full of hope, the lows tender and reflective. She poured herself into every measure, allowing the melody to tell her story and, in turn, the stories of everyone listening. At one point, she closed her eyes completely, feeling the music flow through her as if it had a life of its own. She remembered her father, remembered sitting beside him as a child, learning the very first notes. She remembered the quiet evenings spent practicing alone, the small victories, the moments of frustration, the moments of pure joy. All of it came together in this performance, and she let it spill out with honesty and grace. The audience was captivated. Some leaned forward as though trying to catch every sound. Others sat back, letting the music wash over them. A few were crying quietly, unable to stop themselves. She could feel it, the connection between her and the people in the room. It was fragile, invisible, yet stronger than anything she had ever experienced. As she approached the final section of the piece, the melody slowed slightly, softening with tenderness. She allowed the notes to linger longer, creating small pauses where the silence itself became part of the story. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the intensity of the emotions she was feeling. Every note was a memory, every chord a feeling she had kept hidden for too long. The last few notes were delicate, almost fragile. She pressed them softly, letting them resonate and fade naturally. Then for a moment there was complete silence. The room seemed to hold its breath. She lowered her hands from the keys, unsure if anyone would speak, unsure if anyone would move. Then it happened. A single clap rang out. It was quiet at first, but it was enough to break the spell. Soon more hands joined in, and before long the entire hall was filled with applause. It started softly but quickly grew louder and louder, echoing through the room with power and warmth. People rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, wiping tears from their eyes. Some were laughing softly through their tears, overwhelmed by the beauty they had just witnessed. The woman at the piano sat quietly for a moment, stunned by the intensity of the reaction. She had never expected this. She had never imagined that one song, played honestly and simply, could touch so many hearts at once. The host stepped forward, clapping enthusiastically. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice shaking slightly with emotion, "what we have just experienced is something rare. Music like this doesn't just entertain. It reaches inside you, reminds you of what is important, what is real, and what is beautiful in life. We are all blessed to have witnessed this tonight." The woman stood slowly, her hands still trembling slightly, and bowed gently. She felt a warm rush of gratitude toward the audience. She had never played for recognition, but she understood now that what she had given them was more than music. She had shared a piece of herself, and in return, they had given her something equally valuable: their attention, their emotion, their hearts. People came forward to thank her, to shake her hand, to share how the music had moved them. Some spoke softly, their voices full of tears and wonder. Others simply smiled, unable to find words that could express what they felt. She listened quietly, smiling, humbled by the kindness and honesty in their reactions. That night, as she walked home under the stars, she felt lighter than she had in years. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from quiet practice in a small room to playing in front of people who were truly listening. It hadn't been easy, and she had been nervous, but the reward had been more than she could have imagined. She entered her home and sat at her piano once more. The room was quiet, but the echoes of the applause and the warmth of the audience lingered in her heart. She pressed a single key softly, smiling to herself. It was a reminder that music could heal, could connect, could transform not only those who listened, but also the one who played. That night, she understood something profoundly simple. It wasn't about being famous, or winning accolades, or performing perfectly. It was about honesty, courage, and the willingness to share something true. She had played just one tune, and it had changed everything. The memory of the applause, the tears, the wide-eyed children, and the adults who smiled through their own emotions stayed with her. She knew she would never forget it. And she also knew that this was only the beginning, that her music would continue to reach people, one note at a time, for as long as she was willing to play. She sat quietly for a long while, letting the quiet settle around her, the piano resting beneath her hands. She whispered softly to herself, "Thank you, not just to anyone, but to life, to music, and to the courage that had carried her through that unforgettable night." And as she finally left the piano, the soft glow of the lamp lighting her way, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: complete, quiet happiness. She had shared a part of herself with the world, and the world had responded with the most beautiful gift of all. Hearts touched, souls moved, and a room filled with thunderous applause and tears.